in the Hispanic world. Right now it has under contract a new book that I believe is connected to her presentation today. That is going to be called, I believe, Kiko, Cultural Legacies of Slavery in Modern Spain, 19th to 21st century. That is under contract with SUNY University Press, and probably part of the presentation today has to do with the actual, with the writing of this volume, and the conversation we will have tomorrow probably. We can go into details about it. And thank you for coming to Brooklyn College. It's for us a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you.
I believe there is it's like, makes sense the connection we have with the last people that we brought to the farm. There was Donato Ndongo, who was presenting one book here in 2019, right before the actual pandemic came. And now we have the honor of having with us Professor Suchilla, that for all the people that work in Spanish studies, both in Spain and America, and in particular in the United States, has been a reference. So thank you, Kiko, and
well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. And I really appreciate my colleague, Elzbieta Skłodowska, who is here, Cuban specialist. And David also, right? You're both working in the public library. So yeah, Elzbieta and David are both working in the public library. So, so first I'd like to thank Dr. Alex Alonso and Dr. Gaston Alonso of the Ethel Wolf Institute for the Humanities and the Dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences for the invitation to speak here, as well as all the programs that have generously co-sponsored my visit, the Departments of History, Modern Languages and Literatures, Puerto Rican and Latino Studies and Sociology, and the Women program in Women and Gender Studies. And as I said before, I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today, and I thank you all for coming to my presentation. So this talk comes from, as Alex mentioned, a chapter of a collective volume I'm co-editing on the cultural legacies of slavery in modern Spain, the 19th through the 21st centuries. And I'm also trying to secure an NEH grant right now to supplement this volume with a digital humanities project, which will consist of a web app with access to archival materials and maps of memory sites of slavery in Spain, as well as an interactive blog on current events related to how Spanish society is confronting the legacies of slavery. So the idea is to make this project accessible to a wider public beyond the academy. So, now to the talk proper. The general public is well aware by now that monuments and statues around the world have become sites of contested memory. Monuments typically commemorate a particular version of history and its players, evoking a common identity or a heritage that a community presumably shares. This heritage, as Stuart Hall has argued, is bound up with the meaning of the nation. It is a, quote, discursive practice, one of the ways in which the nation constructs for itself a sort of collective social memory, unquote. Thus, public memory emerges as a product of the struggle between social groups to gain cultural authority to selectively represent and narrate their pasts. We need only remember the battle waged by many Southerners in the U.S. to preserve the Confederate monuments as emblems of their heritage and regional pride, despite their association with slavery, Jim Crow, and resistance to the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. That these monuments have come to represent the myth of the lost cause through which white Southerners sought to uphold the ideology of white supremacy and extend its legacies into the future is a clear testament to the racialized nature of collective memory. Yet the meaning of memory sites is always open to revision and contestation by subsequent generations, as shown by the toppling of racist monuments in recent years. Previously accepted versions of collective memory, enshrined in public spaces, monuments, and place names for years, have the potential to undergo a shift with changes in historical and political circumstances. These public spaces holding one version of collective memory can thus be transformed into spaces of resistance, generating new political conversations and altering the ways in which a community understands its past. Lisa Nauer and Daniel Walkowitz in Contested Histories in Public Space refer to memory sites as palimpsests, where the narratives of opposing sides struggled for control over the foundational myth that monuments and other historical sites represent. The most cherished myth of a community often tied to notions of national identity, are transformed into collective memory through the act of commemoration. Yet of greater importance for these scholars is to examine critically, and this also comes from Nauer and Walkowitz, quote, how and when the myth gained currency, whose interest it serves, and what power relations are revealed or masked, unquote. They go on to argue for the need to situate within a broader historical context the battles over memory sites as the myth and narratives that nations have mobilized around them and the heritage they presumably represent are far from monolithic. Rather, different institutions and communities within the nation can also reinforce, reshape, or undermine these narratives. Monuments, therefore, are not embodiments of history in any objective sense, as many opposed to the dismantling of racist monuments have claimed, but rather sites of negotiation where disparate viewpoints of stakeholders who claim a right to determine their meaning vie for authority. And the term stakeholders is from Upton Dell's work on monuments in contemporary southern U.S. My presentation today will focus on the public debates around two principal monuments in Barcelona connected to slavery and colonialism. The first one being the monument to the Cantabrian slave trader Antonio Lopez y Lopez, and the second one is a monument to Columbus, which is, of course, much better known to the international community. How many of you have heard of Antonio Lopez y Lopez? Probably, yes. If you're in Barcelona, you have, but otherwise, probably not. So this discussion needs to be considered in view of the fact that Catalonia has been a region with strong connections to the illegal slave trade in the 19th century. Antonio Lopez y Lopez, whose statue was constructed in a public square bearing his name near the port of Barcelona, was a key figure in 19th century Iberian transatlantic history, particularly in his connection to the slave trade. For the historical context, I draw on the work of the historian Martín Rodrigo, who's documented extensively Lopez's connections to the transatlantic slave trade. So anyone who wants actually evidence of his connection, despite denial from many different corners, there is plenty of actual documentation there. So let me begin with a bit of background on Antonio Lopez. And here's an image of him from La Ilustración Española y Americana. He was born in 1817 in the small town of Comillas in northern Spain, traveled to Cuba in his youth, and made his fortune through the slave trade. On his return to Spain in 1853, he settled in Barcelona and used this capital to build a vast industrial empire there, founding three major companies. First, the Transatlantic Shipping Company, established in 1857, whose steamships were used in the colonial wars in Morocco in 1859 and Cuba between 1868 and 78. The Hispano-Colonial Bank, established in 1876, which lent money to the Spanish government for the Cuban War, and the Philippine Tobacco Company, established in 1881, which was Spain's first transnational company, also created with slave trade money. Thus, Lopez not only became a pivotal figure in building Catalonia's economic infrastructure, but also in sustaining Spanish colonialism in Africa and Spanish America. Yet many Catalans prefer to remember Lopez as a patron of the arts, who sponsored writers and artists of Catalonia's cultural renaissance. Others continue to exalt his image as a self-made man who left the nation with an important cultural patrimony, conveniently overlooking the ignominious origins of his fortune. The case of Lopez's statue in Barcelona illustrates not only the conflicting claims to history made by various stakeholders, to go back to Upton Dell's term, who have been engaged in the polemic over the years, but also the changes in the symbolic meaning of the statue. That is to say, while controversy around the statue and the public space where it has stood has existed since the moment of its construction, historical and political factors that motivated the controversies have shifted over the years, thus transforming the public memory associated with the site. When the monument's construction began in September of 1883, and the original monument is to, the image of the original monument is to the left, with authorization of Barcelona City Council, the Spanish nation was facing the imminent loss of its last colonies overseas. Except in Africa, they still have colonies. In this context, the monument of the returned immigrant, or the Indiano, stood as a symbol of and nostalgia for empire rather than of racial supremacy per se, as it would later come to represent. According to one press account of the time, a group of prominent merchants in Barcelona took the initiative to propose the construction of the statue dedicated to Lopez's memory as a tribute for having established his business operations and, quote, for having associated himself during his life with all the businesses of true interest, unquote, for Catalonia and its capital. Barcelona's then mayor embraced this project wholeheartedly, praising the Marquis as, quote, one of the men to whom the country owed the most, unquote. The original monument was torn down on August 24, 1936, after the outbreak of the Civil War by the popular demand of the anarchists, who had left on the statue's pedestal a red and black flag symbolizing anarchism. They also left an inscription renaming the city square as a plaza of Captain Biardot, martyr of liberty, who had lost his life defending the Catalan state during the revolt of October 6, 1934. And the Catalan state was the first pro-independence party, which is proclaimed within the Second Republic. The Second Republic was during 1931 and 36. So Catalan workers of the 1930s who participated in the revolutionary general strike were protesting against fascism and affirming the sovereignty of Catalonia. In this context, Lopez's statue became an iconic representation of the monarchy and of the economic elite identified with the rise of fascism, against which the Catalan working classes stood in defiance. An article published in a Republican newspaper, it was called El Diluvio, urging Barcelona city halls to take down the slave trader statue, refers to Lopez precisely as, quote, the great servant of the Alphonsine dynasty, the sinister figure who best symbolizes the black hordes of fascism, unquote. That's 8 years later, that's in 1944, during Franco's fascist dictatorship, the pro-Franco Barcelona City Council ordered the restoration of the statue is in itself a symbolic act with clear ideological implications. And the restored statue is there to the right. Right of you. This reconstructed statue has remained in place in the neighborhood of Ciutat Vella at the bottom of Via Laietana, a major thoroughfare in Barcelona by the seafront, until its final removal in 2018. It took years, 74 to be exact, for the statue to be taken down, even though various citizens groups have been calling for its removal since the end of Franco's dictatorship in 1975. Since Franco's death, there have been a number of emblematic moments in national and global history that have led to shifts in public attitudes toward the Lopez Monument. The first was the emergence of the historical memory movement in Spain, which led to the passage of the Law of Historical Memory in 2007 under the socialist government of José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero to recognize the rights of those who suffered persecution during the Spanish Civil War and the ensuing dictatorship, and to promote reparation and recovery of all public, of a personal and family memory of these citizens. Article 15 of the Law of Historical Memory mandated the removal of all public symbols and monuments commemorating the fascist dictatorship or its protagonists. Catalonia had passed its own version of the law 2 months earlier to recover democratic memory. It's in the context of these laws that the movement to dismantle the slave trader statue gained momentum. Since 2010, the communist and socialist labor unions, as well as the anti-racist organization SOS Racisme, have been demanding the removal of Lopez's statue. The election of grassroots activist Ada Colau as the first woman mayor of Barcelona in 2015, and the appointment of a commissioner of memory programs, who was historian Ricard Viñas, pushed the city forward in applying the laws of historical memory. Elsewhere, they were really dragging their feet in applying the laws of historical memory. The decision to take down Lopez's statue was delayed another 3 years due to the opposition of conservative political groups, but pressure by the Popular Unity candidacy, which I'll be calling CUP, which is a left-wing pro-Catalan independence party, led to a vote in the Barcelona City Council that recommended the removal of the statue in 2018. The same statue was finally removed in March of 2018. And here's an image of the statue being removed. However, the pedestal remains in place to this day. And here is an image of the remaining pedestal and, a closer, it's close-up of that. Displaying allegorical engravings celebrating Lopez's business ventures. They're on the four sides of the statues, as well as an inscription of King Alphonse XII's words glorifying the Marquis' service to the nation. That's a quote. Moreover, Colau, mayor of Barcelona, Colau's promised multi-consultation in June of 2018 to rename the plaza was significantly delayed, and it was not until June of 2021 when the city finally announced its plans to change the name of the square to Plaza Idrissa Diallo after a Guinean immigrant who died at a foreigners' detention center in Barcelona in 2012 after being denied humanitarian aid. The official name change didn't occur until March of 2022, 4 years after the statue had been removed. And here's the old, the old sign and the new one for the square. What interests me beyond the removal of the statue, which admittedly was an important symbolic gesture on the part of Barcelona City Council, are the different public debates that have ensued concerning the question of what should be done with a dismantled statue, if and how the square should be renamed, and how the public space itself might be recontextualized. The city spent over 40,000 euros on the public festivities to celebrate the statue's removal. Defining the spectacle as a carefully constructed media event, Jordi Guixé, the founder of the EROM, which is a transnational network of institutions and organizations committed to the promotion of memory initiatives, asks if this was really an effective strategy for re-signifying the symbol of Lopez's cultural patrimony for the general public, especially since once dismantled, the statue was placed in a space of, quote, public invisibility, unquote, in a museum warehouse. And it was placed in the warehouse of the Museum of the History of Barcelona, and it's not open to the public, but my understanding is that researchers are allowed entry into this warehouse to see the monument if they, they come with permission, authorization. At the same time, the images and inscriptions on the remaining pedestal continue to prolong the legacies of the slave trader. At the base of the pedestal, on what was the front side of the statue, contains a segment of the Catalan national poet Jacinto Verdaguer's epic poem La Atlántida, Atlantis in translation, which, as scholar Lisa Cerullo notes, quote, characterized Indianos, who are returned immigrants, as the noble heirs of Columbus and Spain's glorious early empire, unquote. And there is an image of the poem, which is at the base of the pedestal. That Verdaguer, as an employee of the transatlantic shipping company, wrote the poem dedicated to Lopez aboard his ship during the journey between Cuba and Spain, adds another layer to the interconnection between colonialism and Catalan nationalism. And Verdaguer was also Lopez's personal chaplain. On the other side of the pedestal is an inscription from a telegraph sent by King Alphonse XII on the occasion of the Marquis' death, which reads, Spain has lost one of the men who lent it greatest service. And as mentioned earlier, the question of how to rename the square remained a source of controversy following the city's decision to remove Lopez's statue. One citizens group proposed that it be renamed Plaza of Popular Uprisings to commemorate the uprisings against authoritarianism that took place between 1835 and 1843. And these were the Carlist Wars. Others wanted the plaza to be renamed after Nelson Mandela. And another activist group fighting to close down detention centers for immigrants petitioned to rename the square after the aforementioned Guinean immigrant Idrissa Diallo. Finally, a Pan-Africanist group presented a petition to rename the plaza after the Haitian physician Alphonse Arceline, who in 1991 led the protest against the controversial Negro de Banyoles exhibit at the Darder Museum of Natural History, which is actually a visit of a mummified human being of African descent. If you want to read about the ins and outs of this controversy. Susan Martin Marcus has a short section in her book Disorientation on this whole issue. While the first proposal highlighted the working class struggle so foundational to the narrative of post-industrial Barcelona, the second sought to commemorate a figure who became a symbol of the struggle against white supremacy and institutional racism, and an advocate for universal human rights. Yet some have problematized the proposed renaming of the square after Mandela as a way of deflecting the problem of colonial violence and racism away from the present time and national space of Catalonia, thus erasing its own colonial past. The last two proposals, in contrast, demanded a recognition of the legacies of colonialism and slavery and of racism against individuals of African descent in the specific context of Catalonia. In a broader sense, these debates all call attention to the very nature of public memory, shaped by different sectors of society with their own stakes in the memory battle. Thus, we return to the question of who were the stakeholders in this controversy and what were the stakes. In 2014, Lisa Ciruelo argued that the demands of the 21st century union workers who campaigned for the removal of the statue largely privileged their working class identity over the rights of enslaved individuals. In 2017, another scholar claimed along the same lines that the critique of the monument emerged not so much as a response to Lopez's overt links to the slave trade, but to the reconstruction of the monument in 1944 by Franco's fascist regime. Ada Colau's own public stand on the issue was that the statue's removal was a political act of reparation for the nation's colonial past, and more specifically, for the crime of slavery. Yet some viewed Colau's decision to remove the statue and subsequently to rename the square where it stood as a, quote, part of a broader political campaign to address Spain's fascist past, unquote, rather than a critique of its colonial past. While an advocacy for women's rights, or workers' rights, and the stand against fascism are not incompatible with a critique of colonialism and the legacies of slavery, the question is precisely which narrative has been privileged in different moments and different situations. In Catalonia, the issues of race and colonialism have often been subordinated to those of class and Catalan nationhood. The city council's decision ultimately to rename the plaza after the Guinean Idrissa Diallo seemed to be a deliberate gesture to bring the contemporary issues of race and immigration in Spain to the forefront. In March of 2022, the city placed 2 plaques in front of the pedestal to contextualize the monument and to explain to the public the history of the plaza and the reason for the statue's removal. If earlier in the century, the reclamation of the working class and anti-fascist activists propelled the demand to remove racist and colonial monuments, more recently, as a consequence of the global impact of the BLM movement, anti-racist, Pan-Africanist, and immigrant advocacy groups, as well as a small group of decolonial artist activists have become more visible in the public space, protesting the silencing of the nation's colonial past. And I have actually talked to people in almost all of these groups, and there are some ongoing and upcoming initiatives around the whole idea of monuments and commemoration. A number of compelling artistic initiatives have provoked reflection and dialogue around the commemorated figure by recontextualizing it by producing counter-narratives to re-signify it. Back in 2014, art activist Daniela Ortiz, a Barcelona-based Peruvian immigrant, and Jose Quiroga Garcia Boente, Galician, organized a photography and video exhibit titled Estat Nación, Nation State, for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, the MACBA. And their objective was to, quote, read the slave-based colonial past of Barcelona through its statues, commemorative plaques, and buildings, unquote, to critique symbols of colonialism and the general historical amnesia in Catalonia about slavery and other forms of colonial exploitation in the Americas. That the exhibit was hosted by a high-profile museum in the Catalan capital represented a significant step forward in the recognition of efforts to raise public consciousness about these issues, And this exhibit was actually financed by the Ministry of Culture of Spain, by the Generalitat, and the Barcelona City Council. In June of 2018, an anti-racist collective creatively transformed the pedestal where Lopez statue once stood by painting the faces of African immigrants on its front facade, along with a sign that explains the Marquis' crimes against humanity. Part of their activism consisted of producing a video to document their anti-racist cultural work and to disseminate it on social media. The following year, Nuria Ricard and Jordi Guixer published on the EROM website their proposal for an anti-slavery counter-monument to recontextualize this dismantled statue of the Marquis. The statue, and that's kind of the image of their proposal, which may not, I'm not sure how well you can read it. The statue would be placed in a glass tomb to be displayed on the plaza, submerged under the Mediterranean waters, symbolically returning Lopez to the same seas from which he had arrived, having profited from the slave trade. Though the proposed exhibit never materialized, Ricard and Guixer explained that it was meant to, quote, dethrone the Marquis, de-hierarchizing his statue, unquote, prompting the public to reflect on the connection between the past and the present. In January 2022, the French street artist James Colomina, known for making political statements through his public art, surprised the citizens of Barcelona by secretly installing a sculpture titled Humanity on the pedestal where the statue of Antonio Lopez once stood to commemorate the anniversary of the official abolition of the slave trade in Spain. The sculpture consisted of two bright red figures of a teddy bear and a young man, presumably an immigrant, according to him, embracing. According to the artist, it was a, quote, a symbol of the positive relationship between men, regardless of skin, color, sex, or religion, unquote. Although the statue was erected without official permission, the city allowed it to remain standing until mid-February, and the name of the plaza was changed shortly thereafter to that of the Guinean immigrant. And that was in March of 2022, once again. And just this past summer, activists surrounded the base of the pedestal with silhouette images of immigrants, along with signs proclaiming the importance of Black lives and demanding the closure of the immigrants' detention center. And these artistic initiatives contributed to raising the community's awareness not only of past injustices, but also of the ongoing legacies of slavery and colonialism in the present. The other major monument that has become the object of controversy in Barcelona, not surprisingly, is the one dedicated to Columbus. And, you know, most of you have probably at least seen images of, if you haven't seen it in person, of this monument. Erected by the port at the foot of the famous Ramblas, not far from the Lopez Monument, the Columbus Monument was inaugurated on June 1st, 1888, on the occasion of the Universal Expo of Barcelona. And as you can see on the plaque, the monument commemorated Columbus' first voyage to the Americas and the success of the Catholic monarch's imperial enterprise. On his return to Spain in April of 1493, he reported to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in their Barcelona court. Yet, as historian Martin Rodrigo has shown, the timing of the Columbus Statue Initiative, which developed in parallel to the Universal Expo, that is, from 1881 to 1888, was more than a mere coincidence. For the Catalans who celebrated the construction of the Columbus Monument in the 1880s, it came to symbolize the connection between the dream of the medieval Catalan Empire and the economic ambitions of those in the 19th century who traveled to the Americas to seek fortune and who, on their return to the metropolis, invested their newly found capital in the emergent industrial economy of the region. The nearly simultaneous inauguration of the three projects, the Columbus and Güell monuments, and Joan Güell, and it was another industrialist whose son, a wealthy industrialist whose son married Lopez's daughter, and he was a founder of an anti-abolitionist organization. And although there have actual historical documentation of his connection to slavery, slave trade has not been found, there are pretty clear there have been many speculations that probably there was a much more direct connection that we know, right? Than is documented at this time. So anyway, the simultaneous inauguration of the Columbus Monument, the Güell Monument, Joan Güell has his own monument in Barcelona, and the Universal Expo in the presence of the minister, Queen Regent, and the future King of Spain, expressed in Rodrigo's words, quote, the symbolic power of a bourgeois deeply connected in time of the Restoration with the Spanish national and colonial project, unquote. Entangled with the imperial implications of the Columbus Monument with Barcelona's project of modernity. The 1888 Universal Exposition was in itself a carefully orchestrated spectacle intended to inaugurate the city's entry into modernity as a European metropolis. Thus, the monument represented a gateway to the transatlantic empire and hence to modernity and progress. And we know that in the Spanish state, as elsewhere, colonialism was seen as a condition for and actually constitutive of modernity. Also, the monument was to complement the 19th century urban planning projects to modernize the city and to offer its visitors the opportunity to imagine the new America of modern Spain by symbolically reenacting Columbus's voyage of discovery. The choice of location for the monument was in itself strategic, as it was to be constructed at the point of intersection of the city's major avenues at the time, including the world-famous Rambla, and it would be the first site to greet those arriving at the port. So basically, this is where, you can see where where the red dot is, where the Plaza Antonio Lopez, the name has not been changed on Google Maps. And then if you go down, and then you can see where the monument to Columbus is. And then, of course, to the right is the Mediterranean. So at almost I can't do the pointer here. So at almost 200 feet, it was the tallest monument in the world at the time of its construction. And given its size and complexity, it could not have been completed without the private financial contributions of wealthy industrialists, bankers, and the elite Catalan society, including, guess who, Antonio López, his son, who was the president of the Sociedad de Crédito Mercantil, and his son-in-law, Eusebi Güell. So in view of this context, I now turn to present-day responses to the Columbus Monument in Barcelona to scrutinize the relationship between the politics of commemoration and national history. After the monument's completion in 1888, Catalonia ceased to participate in official Spanish commemorations of Columbus, even during the quarter-centenary celebrations held in 1892 in other parts of Spain. While the city of Barcelona capitalized on the monument for touristic purposes, transforming it into an icon of its capital, historian Stéphane Michonneau argues that it no longer had the same meaning as the other Columbus monuments inaugurated elsewhere in Spain, whose primary purpose was to exalt the monarchy and the religious reconquest. He notes that celebrations of Columbus on October 12th in Catalonia came about only with a revival of notions such as Hispanidad and Raza, Hispanity and race, in the years following the colonial laws of 1898. The National Day of Spain, celebrated on October 12th of each year, was established in 1892 through the royal decree of the Queen Maria Cristina of Austria to commemorate Columbus' conquest of the Americas. Originally called Dia de la Raza, the holiday later came to be known as the Dia de la Hispanidad when it was first celebrated in Madrid in 1935. The notion of race, particularly that of Latin race in Spain, had much more to do with genealogy and with purity of blood than with biology or skin color, and it emerged from within a uniquely Spanish imperialist discourse. In other words, the ideology of Hispanidad, or Pan-Hispanism as it came to be called, represented a colonizing gesture whereby the Spanish state sought to re-assimilate Spanish America into the former empire by claiming a spiritual or cultural unity among the Spanish-speaking world. The national holiday subsequently became institutionalized in 1958 during the Franco dictatorship. His regime further exploited the myth of Hispanism to serve its national Catholic agenda and exalt the fascist dictatorship. More notably, the legacies of this ideology persisted well beyond the end of the dictatorship. Following Spain's transition to democracy, the socialist government of Felipe González at the time passed a law in 1987 to affirm October 12th as a national holiday. And just last October, 2022, the current president, Pedro Sanchez, also a socialist, presided over the celebration, complete with a monarch's presence, a full-fledged military procession, and a reception in the royal palace for prominent politicians and diplomats. In Barcelona, while Ada Colau has refused to participate in the October 12th festivities, tweeting that it was a celebration of genocide, the ideology of Hispanism has not completely disappeared in response to the national holiday. Conservative, and I'm talking now about Catalonia in particular, conservative anti-independence Catalans have taken to the streets to reclaim their national identity as Spaniards and to call for unity under the banner of the Central Spanish state, echoing the discourse of Francoism. The colonial art activist Daniela Ortiz, whom I mentioned earlier, claims that even some Catalan nationalists who favor independence from the Spanish state, by which they believe to be colonized, have often turned a blind eye to Catalonia's own complicity in Spanish colonial history. During the National Day of Catalonia on September 11th of 2013, which, by the way, is a completely different holiday from the Spanish National Day, Ortiz and Garcia Boente filmed a video that shows her visiting sites in Barcelona related to slavery and colonialism. When she arrives at the Ciutadella Park where the celebrants are congregated, she goes around and asks them whether they would vote in favor of dismantling the monument to Columbus were there to be a referendum on this issue. The answers range from, no, it doesn't bother me, to, no, it's a symbol of Barcelona, to no, it's a historical monument to the man who discovered America, unquote, to the incredulous response of, why would we want to do that? When Ortiz explained the reasons, namely what Columbus symbolized for people who are victims of colonial violence, and noted that most Catalans wanted Francoist monuments removed, one person replied, quote, no, it's not the same thing because Franco was a dictator of Spain. There was a war and a lot of people died. Columbus is different, unquote. And when Ortiz quipped, during colonization, nobody died, her interlocutor replied, quote, but that was so many years ago. So you can see where these conversations went. The following year, in 2014, Ortiz produced another video called Replica, in which she is filmed kneeling in front of the people who were gathered at the Plaza of Catalunya, which is kind of like the center of Barcelona, to celebrate the National Day of Spain, imitating the posture of an indigenous person kneeled before a Spanish priest in a sculpture at the base of the pedestal of the Columbus Monument. And we can, of course, comment on all the problems with the representation of the indigenous person in this sculpture. So there's the part of the Columbus Monument with a statue of the indigenous person kneeled in front of Father Boyle. Ortiz included a text in the video urging her audience to reflect on the history of colonization and the colonial symbols around them. And there she is kind of like imitating going up to people. And it's just a whole performance, right? To prove a point. So urging her audience to reflect on the history of colonization and the colonial symbols around them. And there she also produced this text. And finally, on October 12, 2015, members of a radical grassroots collective calling itself Fuck the Fascism protested the celebration through the performative gesture of symbolically raping the Columbus Monument as a response to a colonizer's own violence. Through their performance, these activists transformed the act of rape, often employed as a trope for colonial violence, gender masculine, into a palimpsestic counter-narrative that challenged the status of the monument as a colonial symbol. And according to one of the organizers, the group has continued their protests yearly on October 12th, covering the conqueror's figure with feces and with the blood of one of the performers. And throughout the past decade, COP, the left-wing pro-independence party, has demanded that the Columbus statue be taken down. And in 2016, COPE first presented a petition to the city of Barcelona asking not only that the statue be removed along with that of Lopez and that the Spanish flag and other symbols of the monarchy be taken down from municipal buildings, but also that October 12th no longer be allowed to be celebrated. COPE proposed to replace the monument and all the ornaments at the base of the column commemorating the conquest with, quote, a symbol of American resistance against imperialism, oppression, and indigenous and Afro-American segregation, unquote. Their petition was not approved. Yet again in 2018, after the Lopez statue was finally dismantled in March, COPE renewed its demands to have the Columbus monument removed, this time by proposing to create a space to place it at the service of the historical memory of the popular classes. That's a quote. This demand was conveniently timed to coincide with municipal workers' fight for better working conditions, but again, COPE failed to get their demands met. Most recently, in June of 2020, amidst the global protest against racism, the public debate around this monument was revived yet once again. This time, the president of the coalition, Catalonia in Common, which is Ada Colau's own platform, agreed to remove the Columbus monument. Referring to racism against a Moroccan teen who died in custody in July of 2019 at a juvenile center in Andalusia, and more generally against temporary African workers in Spain, she deliberately drew a connection between institutionalized racism of the present, codified by the Ley de Extranjería, which is their immigration law, and colonialism of the past. However, hours later, she backtracked on social media, stating that the sculpture needed to be contextualized in its present site. A few days later, Colau declared that she would not take down the monument, but that instead she would favor critically contextualizing it in some fashion by placing a plaque or by organizing an exhibit around it. In her words, quote, this statue is an icon of the city of Barcelona, for better or for worse, with everything that it implies. The statue of Columbus forms part of the critical memory of the city. But then she went on to add that it was necessary to continue debating with anti-racist groups and with experts on democratic memory, and to engage in a critical analysis of public art. As of today, there has been no plaque or exhibit around the Columbus statue to contextualize it as in the Idrissa Diallo Plaza, though every October 12th, anti-racist and anti-colonial groups continue to come out to protest. And there have been a lot of flyers all over social media, Twitter, whatever, right, Instagram. We can only speculate on the reasons for Colau's decision to preserve the Columbus statue while agreeing to take down that of Antonio Lopez. And I have a theory, but if anyone wants to ask me about it later, feel free to do so. What is, however, evident is that Catalan nationalist identity politics have always been deeply entangled with colonialism. Columbus has been transformed into the icon of Catalanidad, or Catalan identity, much as it has always been a symbol of Spanish colonialism. A 2019 exhibit at the MACBA titled Undefined Territories, the Colonial Legacy in Art, included a series of works by diasporous artists of various geographical origins to critique colonialism, of which the work of the aforementioned artist Daniela Ortiz also formed a part. Her work, which included a series of photographs, videos, and a text, linked Columbus to Catalan national identity. In Ortiz's words, her work on Columbus was just one small part of her exhibit, whose objective was to critique the role of colonial monuments in the construction of collective memory in Catalonia. Some members of the public, goaded on by the conservative anti-independence political party, Ciudadanos, reacted to her project by accusing her of falsifying Catalan history. In June of 2020, the TV program Espejo Público, which broadcasts public interest news, interviewed Ortiz, asking her to explain why she felt the Columbus monument should be dismantled. She stressed once again the connection between the statue as a colonial symbol and present-day racist immigration policies in Catalonia. The presenter then interjected the comment that the statue didn't offend her, to which the artist quipped back, quote, "Of course, it's because you're white," unquote. This comment, along with Ortiz's statement that Spain was a racist country, provoked a strong public reaction, and from this day on, the Peruvian artist became the target of racist harassment on social media. Right-wing groups jumped on the bandwagon and threatened to denounce her to the government as a terrorist, and according to her, the Catalan left also joined this defamation. By her account, she decided to leave the country for the sake of her own and her son's safety after having lived in Barcelona as an immigrant for 13 years. This incident shows the challenges of doing decolonial and anti-racial cultural work in the Spanish state, and this includes Catalonia, of intervening in these public spaces that hold collective memory to desacralize and divest colonial or racist monuments of taken for granted historical narratives that have long gone unchallenged. In fact, there's been quite a bit of pushback from reactionary groups against more recent efforts to force a reckoning of Catalonia's role in the slave trade. Recently, they aired this documentary, Negreros, La Catalunya Esclavista, which was broadcast on TV3 in February, and it was met with tremendous resistance and with attempts to revive imperial nostalgia, and not only from among the conservative Spanish establishment, but also from the Catalan left. And Celeste Munoz Martinez, who's at the University of Barcelona, actually did a really great public-facing piece on this in one of the periodicals alternative periodicals in Barcelona. Yet, art and cultural work, by refiguring public symbols and spaces, offer a potential for revising our view of history. Though public debates about slavery and reparatory justice are long overdue in the Spanish state, it's significant that many anti-racist and immigrant advocacy groups at the local level, including Pan-Africanist organizations, are reclaiming the public spaces where colonial monuments have stood as symbols of power. The fact that the newly renamed Plaza Idrissa Diallo has now become, as of late, a gathering place for anti-racist and pro-immigrant advocacy activists shows how space can quite literally transform memorial practice, turning symbols of power into sites of protest and resistance. Art historian Sarah Beetham has said, quote, "Statues themselves are not history. Statues are memory, important aspects of visual culture that can tell us things about historical moments and people who put them up. Anything that happens to those statues is itself adding other layers of history to them," unquote. Or another way to put it is that memory is living history. And I hope to have shown through the trajectory of these monuments how these layers of living history are continuously being revised, transforming memory sites into contested territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Akiko, for your presentation. And now we have some time, like 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, please.
Oh,
I want to know, how did you choose your, do we do Spanish or English? Or doesn't matter?
You can ask him whatever question, I mean, you can, and I can, answer in English so everyone can understand. But, if there are people who are not Spanish speakers, maybe, if you're fluent in both, ask in English probably so everybody can understand, please. Yeah, will be better. Yeah.
I want to know, how did you choose the topic? Was it because you were inclined for the
Good question.
Of,
Yeah.
That's a general question,
Yeah.
but I was
Yeah.
wondering.
I guess the microphone is not on. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering how you chose to do this kind of research, because I feel like when I was reading it, I felt inclined to racism more than the actual topic, public memory, just because I feel like, not that it's the most important part, but that, it weighs a lot. So yeah. I was just wondering if that's how you got interested in it?
Thank you so much for that question. So I was working on a project on women in the anti-slavery movement in Spain who were kind of pretty much obliterated from history. So I've been working on looking through archives, seeing what kinds of networks there were among women. Some were well known, like Concepcion Arenal, but others were not. And so to kind of recover the memory of these women, and so at the same time I was doing that project, when I was in Barcelona, I signed up. I saw on the website when I was looking at all these historical memory sites, and I was in touch with a lot of people in historical memory organizations, most of them who were, of course, historical memory meant Francoism and dictatorship, but there was an increasing small group of people who are really working on colonial memory, right? Memory of slavery and colonialism, which is something that was never talked about, and including there are a few historians who are now working on this, but even they had difficulty getting funding from the Spanish government or the Generalitat to do that kind of research. So one of the organizations, the historical memory organization, was doing a kind of a historical route, like a tour, right, for visitors on memory sites. I think they had one on the Civil War. They had one on, and they just recently, I saw that one came up on slavery route. So I did that. I went on that slavery route. And so it started with Güell statue, and it ended with Antonio López y López. And I had, of course, heard of both, but just doing that whole route and kind of thinking about, all these things that are if you look, it's there everywhere, all over Barcelona, and all these buildings, these buildings that are named after whatever, Hotel 1898, where they have a colonial menu and these crazy things. I mean, so all these things that were being done, that were there, and no one thought about it, anything, right? So seeing that, Antonio López y López, and there was also another woman anti-slavery activist that I'm actually trying to find more information on, Clotilde Serrat, and she was also mentioned during that tour. So we started having a conversation. So the guide was he was a historian, and I think he was a PhD student doing work on history, but historical memory was his field. And we started having a conversation on, and it was right around the time, it was when I went, it was 2 months after the statue had been, taken down by the city of Barcelona. So we were having this conversation on, hey, what to do with the space? What are some of the things? Is it you take it down, it disappears, people forget? Is that going to do any good? Is that the best thing? So we started having this conversation, and then I decided that I'm going to write an article on it. It was that's how, and I got really interested in the monuments. And then I started reading a lot more, stuff on different, because this whole thing of recovery of historical memory and coming to reckoning with slavery, it's already been going on for some time in other nations like England, France, Netherlands, right? So U.S., of course. The fact that it was not happening in Spain, and that, that people were not really working on it. And then I said, okay, well, I guess this is a really good time to do it. And it was just right in the aftermath of the statue, it was 2 months after the statue of Antonio López y López was taken down. So that's how I came upon this topic. Yeah.
Thank you. I was very curious.
Thank you very much for this very engaging presentation. I just wanted to know, your thoughts about how the definition of historical memory
Right.
to get some traction in Spain, and it was also started
Yep.
by grassroots movement.
Yes.
The unearthing of the victims of the Spanish Civil War.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
But there Civil War.
Right.
How did the newly definition of democratic movement, democratic memory,
Right.
is going
So,
to be playing out
right.
In this? And
That's precisely the critique.
Yeah.
Even the new democratic memory, the most recent democratic memory, which is supposed to be an improvement over the old one, it does not deal with nothing about colonial memory. And someone pointed that out also in El País. Someone wrote an article just a couple of months ago that historical memory, yes, about Francoism, dictatorship, repression during Francoism and afterwards, but colonialism is completely like absent. And you're reading books like even a major scholar like what's her name? Ana Lucia Araujo, her name, but she has tons of books on this like monuments and commemoration and public memory. And there's nothing on Spain. That's the one country there is absolutely nothing. I heard Portugal is also pretty slow. Even Italy is starting to actually engage pretty actively now. So, but of course, Britain, the whole controversy, U.S., of course, everyone knows, and France with and they actually have public memory kind of like policies, programs, explicit programs defined by the governments, or they actually establish like they establish specific museums, like in Nantes, you have museums to commemorate and to remember the legacies of slavery, but there's nothing resembling that. And not only is there nothing resembling that in Spain, but every time there is people try to put on, well, except for like these very few exceptions, like the ones in Macba, anytime they do try to do an exhibit, it's done in a very colonizing way still. So I've actually been trying to talk to all sorts of people, like curators. I'm talking to a curator, different people in different organizations, on people who are at least the ones who are saying they're trying to decolonize museums and decolonize this, and how they perceive decolonization, what it means to them, and what they're saying versus what they're actually doing, right? Are they returning these things they stole from, from some, Africa, for example? No, they aren't, right? So it's kind of, having talked to a lot of people also, there's also like Pan-Africanist groups. I've been talking quite a bit to people actually of African descent who are trying to, in Spain, and it's a very small group that's getting increasingly vocal, but it's really a challenging task. The society as a whole is not ready for that. Historical memory of Francoism, yes, they are reckoning with the public as a whole, right? I mean, no one at this point is, except for the real right-wing fachas, is going to be arguing about let's why should we change this name from Generalissimo Franco or whatever, right, at this point. But such is not the case as far as, So for example, when the Barcelona City Council took down the monument, the mayor of Comillas wanted the statue, right? And Ada Colau said, absolutely not. And when one of the historians organized a small symposium in Comillas about the historical memory of slavery, blah, 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 and of course they're going to mention Antonio López y López, basically the mayor kicked them out of the town and said you cannot have a conversation about the Marqués de Comillas, Antonio López y López, in my city. So anyway, it's really, that's pretty extreme when you're saying like, hey, you can't talk about, Antonio López y López here because we don't know what you're going to say about him, right? So, and then people have, recently there have been a few people who have written about, we have the new law of historical memory, democratic memory, yet where is, given the really close link between colonialism and Francoism, yet the colonial memory part is missing completely from that document. So, and if you want to see that document, you can just Google it and see it, but there is nothing about, colonial memory. So that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's where it is, I think.
Yeah, what I wanted.
Yeah.
What I wanted to add also is, the law of historical memory was a conversation starter.
Yeah, of course.
Just
Yeah.
wanted to know if this new law, new legislation of democratic memory, you will see this as a conversation starter.
Yeah.
For what is missing there.
Right. Yeah. But again, if nobody is seeing a major aspect of this law that is missing, right? Nobody, not nobody. There are people who are seeing this, but the same people who were on board about getting rid of all Francoist names and monuments and place names and streets and whatever, and reckoning and doing reparations to the families, they're not doing that same thing with colonial memory, right? So then what do we make out of that, right? Spain is still at a place where it's still not able to confront. What do you think? Do you think that there is a movement in some places, or I'm curious. Yeah.
Start a conversation.
Oh yeah.
I think there are many different aspects.
Yeah.
It's not only legislation. It's grassroots small movements, of course.
I agree. Yeah.
Here,
yes.
they are doing their part.
Yes.
So civil society is doing their part as well.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that things cannot change and that we can see in the future.
Okay.
A new legislation that is going to be covering that.
Right.
And as you know, memory is a very contesting
of course
in Spain, and it's a rather recent
everywhere. Yeah, it's not just Spain.
Rather recent aspect of our of Spain's democratic aspect.
Right. No, I agree with you. Totally agree with you. Thank you for that comment. And I have actually been discussing this with members of the group who are working together on this whole legacies of slavery. And one of the things we all agree, and there's a couple of historians, many of them are historians, in fact, is that, there is no official government-sponsored memory program to recover the memory of, like, colonialism, slavery in Spain, whereas, yes, there are official programs, official government-mandated, law of historical memory, yes, of course. So why is it that this one aspect of memory, historical memory, collective memory, is excluded from that, right? That is the question. And I agree totally, there are many groups. In fact, those are the groups I'm actually interested in finding out. And they're here and there, and there are cultural producers, there are people running magazines like Tanya Adam, there are people who are in Pan-Africanist organizations. They finally got the first woman and first person of African descent who was appointed as curator of Makbat like just a year ago, I think. So, and she is really talking about decolonizing the museum. So, so anyway, there are movements there, right? I'm not saying there's no movement, but there's no officially government-sponsored, right, memory program there. So, I don't know. Did I answer that? Or Elciota?
I think you.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about what you were saying. Is it because we're still living in it? Like we're still living. It's not like we're looking into history. Yes, we're looking into history, but we're still living in it. So why look into something that is going to reflect and bring out the issues that we have today?
Right.
So I feel like that's part of why we keep it under the carpet, because it's not,
right.
convenient. It's
yeah.
It's like you were saying how challenging it is to have people to speak up and try to, challenge these memories and bring them back to life. And like, I think of like the youth, right? Because we're here in the class and like we're all taking this class, so we're all interested. right now. But what about people that don't take this class, that chose a different class, or high schoolers?
Hmm?
They don't, we don't get this kind of knowledge in high school.
Right.
And here in, America, in Spain,
Oh, yes,
you don't get
America.
this type of knowledge. So it's like the picture that you have of the monument without the statue before. There's a guy with a dog there. Does that guy know where he's sitting? And how do we get a guy like that to care?
Right, exactly.
How do we get the youth to care about this type of thing?
Right. So this has so many different aspects to it, which is fantastic. So did you want to say something more?
No, just far from the beginning.
Oh, I'm far from the mic. Okay, yeah. So, so the thing about the guy by the statue, same thing happened. Like everyone was sitting around that whatever in University of Virginia, where everyone saw it was a garden or whatever, and no one knew. And once people found out, it was like slave labor had built this, and then things changed completely, right? The way people thought of the place, the way they sat there, the way when they went there, what they were thinking. It was no longer this place to just go and chat and have lunch, right? So it's the same thing. Like you realize, right? I mean, Calhoun College, finally, right? So you have all these things that, unless on the one hand, so this is what part of all these people who had these projects, like organizations or individual, even like Colomina, whatever, I've been in touch with each one of them. They want to do something that's going to call the public's attention to the issue, right? So none of them said, it's all great, it's now the statue's gone. And people would just walk by and it's just a little pedestal and no one will say, it's like, so what, right? It's just a pedestal. No one thinks about anything. But if you're trying to refigure that space and somehow get the people to think about what was there and why, and the other important thing that you mentioned, I think what you said is really important. It's not about the past legacies. It's about the present. Every one of these organizations is making connection to like how immigrants are treated, right? Like Idrissa Diallo, who was thrown into an internment center, was really sick. They did not give him humanitarian or medical aid. He died. They just threw him in an anonymous grave. They would not let the family repatriate him. It's like until very recently. So like this is not, okay, this is one of the legacies of, right, of slavery, right? So it's not just about, it's just not about the past. It's like the fact that, and especially with someone like Antonio Lopez, right? Everything, the city, its industrial infrastructure, economic infrastructure, there is so much, everything is connected, right? They love Gaudí in Barcelona, right? So they have like a park financed by Güell, right? Whose money probably came, son-in-law of Antonio Lopez, and probably he himself was, Joan was there, and blah, 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 the father, and pretty sure they'll probably, eventually someone would dig up documentation saying he was, involved in slavery, but hey, that's like, Antoni Gaudí is like this big, right? I mean, celebrated sculptor, and and how can you possibly, all these patron of the arts, all these people support the arts. Catalan Renaissance, right? So they're so of course, and even scholars will say, well, I've known scholars, I've spoken to scholars myself who are progressive scholars. They're not like right-wing people who say, well, we're all, this is like a problem of presentism. You're just imposing your present day views on the past, and how do you expect the people in the past to have the same kind of awareness and know that what they were doing was wrong? So that argument was also being repeated over and over again, just like it was being repeated in the U.S. when they found out about Thomas Jefferson and the child that he had fathered with Sally Heming, right? So it's a very similar phenomenon, right, in different places. different historical circumstances. But your point is really, both of your points, I think, are really, really important, right? That it's not about only the past. It's connected to the present. It is really about the present. And then, yeah, I mean, if they are not aware and you just walk by this thing every day and you think nothing of it, then, you know, I mean, if you don't learn in your history class that there was slavery, or there was the massacre of indigenous populations, then why would you know, right? So, thanks. I think Elzbieta had a question before, so, oh, over there. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Because I can always have good.
I'll try to be concise in my replies, so.
Thank you very much, Akiko, and I think in response to your question, the trajectory, how the project has been shaping out the process of discovery. So my question has to do with whether you know or sense or imagine the scale of these, you know, remnants, these material traces of, you know, monuments to the enslavers in other areas of Spain. You know, from Galicia to Sevilla.
Right.
And I realized that, you know, you mentioned that you wouldn't have discovered some of these places if it weren't for those tours. And obviously Barcelona, you know, there is a configuration there of awareness, resources, grassroots, and so on, but I'm thinking about places that are perhaps more obscure. So I was just wondering whether you sense the scale of these kind of monuments or sites.
I mean, the existence or people's awareness about what they, yeah, I mean, there are, in Madrid, for example, there have been organization, SOS Racismo is an organization that has been to different places. There are 14 Columbus statues in Spain right now, I believe, and there have been, you know, movements in different places. But again, depending if you're in a really more traditional place, a friend was telling me, like, I forgot where she was, somewhere in. Oh gosh, I forgot the place, but there was Pizarro's statue, and they still celebrate him, and all that stuff. So, and no one ever comes, and that was in a smaller town in Extremadura or something like that. Don't quote me on the place. So, and then there's Comillas itself, where Antonio Lopez y Lopez and Lisa Suerlo actually wrote something on this, which is like he actually built the entire city, kind of celebrating his own identity. It's like the self-made man. I'm kind of, you know, the self-fashioning through architectural works, kind of celebrating himself. And of course, there's also the university with the same architecture, blah, blah, blah. You know, that's in his name, University of the Pontifical, whatever and so there are, you know, so that is, of course, his town. So there's all these statues to celebrate. And then sometimes when I see statues, and I'm like going around with friends, like in Barcelona area, not necessarily in Barcelona, and I see a statue, and my friends know like what I'm working on, and like I'm always looking for statues. And I asked one of them, like, oh, well, do you know where this money comes from? And the person who was very devoted to everything in her town said, "Es dinero limpio," right? Like, this is clean money. And we're like, I said, how do you know? But like the fact that that was the first thing that came out of the person's mouth. This is a very well-educated person, like with a PhD and like that. Like, it wasn't just someone in the street. So, you know, there are monuments, and I know Madrid also, there's been a lot of, they put like smeared red paint over Columbus Monument every October 12th and stuff like that. There is actually a movement there. SOS Racismo actually goes there and does a lot, but those are big cities too. And then like Barcelona, from what I hear, and I don't know if you've been, Alex, in Barcelona during the October 12th, but there's always the two sides there, right? The kind of the right-wing, whatever, and not even, see, that's the other thing. The thing that I always get asked, and which gets very controversial, is the role of like the Catalan nationalist movement, because they are precisely the people who are saying right now that this is not the time and place to talk about this issue, right? So the fact that someone like Daniel Ortiz was also getting all this from, threats and harassment, also from the Catalan nationalists, right? Who are not the people who represent like the Spanish state and central government and all that kind of stuff. So, and they could be Franquista, but they won't see that there's a problem there with the Columbus Monument or Antonio Lopez y Lopez Monument. But there are still, those monuments remaining, although, Franco's monuments are gone. It's required to, even though in the beginning of that law, there were tons of controversy about every Franco's figure, right, being taken down. But, that's gone, and that's pretty much like done with. You're probably not going to see any street signs anymore with names of Francoist generals who, worked under him, blah, blah, blah. But with colonialism, I think, not too much has happened. Yeah.
Okay, I think that we are running late a little bit, so now we are going to meet thank you, Akiko.
Oh, thanks so much.
Everybody.
Yeah, thanks for your questions.
So we see you have some food up there at the department lunch. I see there in 10 minutes or so. Somebody want to help me to get some sodas also? So I see you there. Okay, Julio has the key and also has brought some food up there.